Okay, welcome to the October 23rd, 2024 Finance Subcommittee of the Brookline School Committee. We're going to jump right in with the agenda. The first item, hi Sarah, oh, I don't think she can hear me yet. The first item, and I can't get my computer to toggle over, is the minutes from, is it September 26th or 27th? I can't see the date anymore because my computer's misbehaving.
It was the September 18th joint meeting.
September 18th. Yes, thank you. Can I get a motion for approval of the minutes?
My motion?
Thank you, Sarah. Carolyn, do you second?
Yes.
Okay. Val, how do you vote?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Next item on the agenda is, this is really frustrating to not be able to see what I should be looking at. Sorry,
The next
everyone.
item is review and approval of gifts.
Yeah, I like to be able to actually talk about them. And okay, now I got there. Review and approval of gifts. So we have multiple gifts very kindly offered to the public schools of Brookline. The first one is from the Lawrence School PTO for $3,498 for the subscription renewal for Lexia. The next one is from the Brookline High School PTO for $8,600 for the senior essay workshop. The next is from Shoshana Clark for $500 for the Queer Student Union at the high school. The next one is from Anne Marie Carlson for $25 for the Queer Student Union. Leslie Thompson for $200 for the Outstanding Speaker Series, which I believe is also related to the Queer Student Union. I could be wrong, but I believe those are connected. And then last is an anonymous donor who has given $125,000 to Brookline Food Services for the Zero Waste Initiative. And there is some backup documentation on both the College Essay Workshop, Queer Student Union, and the Outstanding Speaker Series, as well as the letter from the agent of the anonymous donor. Are there any questions on the gifts?
I want to just make a quick comment. It's always worth mentioning that one of the reasons why schools need subscriptions is because when we were trying to trim the budget a bit last time through, we took out some subscriptions, and the teachers have really felt that. Lexia, gives different tiered reading for students to read, and it's an important subscription for us.
Thanks, Sarah. Can I get a motion for
Sorry,
approval?
I have a
Oh,
question.
sorry, go ahead.
So the anonymous donor gift,
Mhm.
I think this came up in something else the other day. So there was also an anonymous gift to the town that created the sustainability division, I think.
We also had, I believe the same anonymous donor gave money last year for the dishwasher installation and purchase of the silverware and trays and all the reusable cutlery and trays.
So I don't think I have any problem with it, but it is interesting. And is that sort of typical to get such a large anonymous donation to the extent that it can create a position? How does that come about? Are we out there seeking these, or does just someone shows up and says, hey, I want to create this and here's the money?
I really don't know. Susan, do you have any information or no?
I don't think we went out seeking it. Usually with gifts, they approach us. Sometimes they'll hear of a need, and then an anonymous donor will submit a letter and some funding. This is my understanding is this is it's the second of a 3-year commitment from them, but they will only make an annual donation. That's my understanding. And so the position, I believe, was added last year and is being funded again this year, and next year would be the 3rd year. And then there is no, I don't believe that there was any commitment to maintaining the position after funding was no longer available.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Is this just it, or then do we have an obligation to provide any kind of reporting to them, or are there strings, or this is
It's a
just
gift and not a grant.
Yeah, any strings would be in the letter
Right.
as it was presented, and so any restrictions on how we spend it, and or any requirement to report back on progress or anything like that would always be stated if there is a requirement in the donor's letter.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, I'll take a motion to approve.
I'll move it.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second,
Thanks, Val. Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes, yes,
Val?
yes.
Carolyn?
Yes.
And I vote yes. The next thing is grant acceptance, if I recall correctly. So there are multiple grants here. And this is about, I think, 115 pages of documentation here, but this is many of our federal entitlement grants. So you can see there's federal Title I for about 350,000. Federal Title II for about 120,000. Federal Title III for 125,000, Federal Title IV for about 50,000, and then our state grant for Metco, which is about $2.35 million. And then finally, there is the Perkins 5, which is for about $67,000, and that's for career and tech ed. Are there any questions of the grant acceptance that we see here? Susan, I had one question, but I don't know if you know this. Do you remember what our Metco was last year? Is this flat level? Is it level funded, an increase, a decrease? Do you happen to know?
Not off the top of my head, I don't.
Okay.
I would
Very
just like
good.
to say for the record that we are getting questions from a group of Metco parents as to how we spend money and how the amount that we spend on Metco compares to the grant that comes in. So I'm looking into that right now.
Isn't
Hopefully-
that historically the grant is a lot lower than what we spend?
That's what I think, but I'm looking into it just so that I'm not answering.
I'm
based
pretty
on-
sure that's a like resounding yes. It's just by a matter of how much.
Yep. But I
Um,
want the parents to have a, real answer, so.
I think one of the things that would help is in the grant documentation, it does give an overview of that. And then the other resource you have is in the budget, we provide a little synopsis of what is funded through the grant in a real succinct way. So it talks about how many staff members and things like that. So those are two ways that we share that information in writing in a public way. So I'm happy to.
That's
share
great. And I
that.
love that the answer is that it's in a public way.
well,
That's,
and the
that's really good.
documentation you have here, Sarah, is literally the details of all the expenditures. It's summarized there, but you can see the exact line items in this documentation, and also hopefully connecting with Malcolm.
Yep.
Okay. Can I get a motion for approval?
So moved.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second.
Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Thank you, Britt, for coming by. The next
you,
item
everyone.
is request for grant whatever submittal. Thank you. And this is for $12,500 for a grant, a proposal to DESE for a tutoring program at one of the homeless shelters in town for students who are non-native English speakers, and it will support them through multilingual tutoring. So any questions or comments on this grant? My comment was it sounds like a really great program. So yeah, supportive. I'll move to approve the submission. Can I get a second?
Second.
Second.
Okay, Carolyn, how do you vote?
Yes.
Val
Yes.
and Sarah?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, next item on the agenda, I think, is position control. Is that right, Betsy?
Yes, that's
Okay.
fantastic. Actually, the next thing is to talk about authorizing the chair of
Oh,
the
yes.
subcommittee
Thank
to
you.
review these types of applications
Okay.
between meetings.
Right. So as I previewed for you all, not at the workshop, but at the previous meeting, there was a request from staff to be able to address these like the submissions, requests for submissions off cycle. So for example, if something is due in 2 weeks, but we're not meeting for until after that, they wanted to be able to submit them in this off cycle. And so the question is, and I think we already talked about this and it seemed like there was no objection, but having the finance chair, which is me for now, be delegated to review them in the off cycle and then report on them, just as like a parallel to what we do with the accounts payable warrant where I report out. And I think it makes sense to have a vote on this so that it's sort of formally documented as opposed to whatever. So this would be a vote to recommend to full school committee to adopt this practice. Susan?
Yes, so one of the things I want to make sure is that they're not submitted randomly to you by staff members, because there is an internal process that should be followed. And once the internal process is followed, then and if that has happened, it would come from me to you and not around the superintendent and I.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So can we get a motion for whatever I just said? A motion to authorize the finance chair to review grants between meetings.
And is that to recommend to the full school committee?
Yes, to
Okay.
recommend to the full school committee.
Should there be some language that speaks to what Susan just said? Like
I think that that's more of a procedure than a process. Like I'll say that, for example, right now in our policy manual, the practice of accounts payable warrant just says that it's delegated to the finance chair. It doesn't say like the whole procedures. It just says that I can sign off on them, just the same way it says that Helen can sign off on the capital warrant. So I don't think we need to talk about that. And my goal would be that when we get to the finance policy redo in the spring, that hopefully we could just tack this in there, Susan, so that way it's sort of formally documented in the policy. But this is sort of a stopgap while we don't have it in the policy. But as far as the procedure go, the procedure should be the right way that Susan described it, but the procedure just gets developed separately from policy. That's my thinking of it.
I think given what we have seen in practice so far, that it's worthy of note that it would be done through from my office to you and not from staff.
Yes, but I don't think we need that in the actual motion. That's all. That's what I was saying. Okay, can we get a vote or a motion? Do we have?
We don't have, did you make the motion, Mariah?
I did make the motion.
Okay, all right. We need a second. Val?
Carolyn, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, the next thing on the agenda
Is
we're
the
cranking
position
through.
plus.
Position control. Okay, do you mind pulling that up?
Yeah, let me grab that.
So this
Can I
is really, no, not yet. It's still in the request for grant submittal. There we go. Do you mind making it, yeah, like 1,000 times bigger?
Mhm.
So as we have been refining this report, which is very handy, we see that a couple of changes from when we saw this last month. One is the net cost now. So it's only showing, rather than showing the cost of that position, it's just showing the net cost so that we only see where there's actual budget impacts. And then as we'd also discussed, this is sort of a running track record of the entire year. So you can see the original batch we discussed in August, then the September batch, and now this new October batch. And so there are 6 positions that were reallocated. And I guess I would throw it open for if people have questions. I have a question, but I'll wait to see if there are other questions from the committee.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And I might have asked this previously in an email. So the recess monitor, Pierce building admin support. So my recollection was that in the budget development process, what was brought to the school committee was that Jamie Yadoff, Principal Yadoff, had some requests for additional staff due to being in two schools. And those were laid out pretty explicitly.
And
And
didn't happen, right? So like she didn't get the second librarian.
Sorry, I'll continue.
Okay.
So what was said was some of what she's requesting is administrative support. So we're asking for 40,000 for that. And then, I just want to understand. So instead of that, that's being switched to something called a recess monitor. And I'm curious whether I don't recall a recess monitor position at other schools. So if that could be explained, because it was so specifically requested in the budget as admin, I'd just like to understand the rationale for changing it to a different newly created position that I'm not sure exists at other schools.
Sure. So what was approved in the budget was a bucket of money to help Jamie as she identified administrative needs to be able to address them. So she has determined that some of her administrative need is to have somebody to monitor kids at recess because they are across the street, and these are the little guys. So she felt it was important to use some of that money for this administrative purpose. It's not
Okay.
$40,000, it's just a component of that. She also used a small amount of money over the summer to help with some administrative support for the move, to help her coordinate that. So it's just, she's using little bits of money here and there as she sees a need that's associated with managing or navigating because of the building project.
So what is the cost of the recess monitor if it's not an even swap for the 40,000? And it's posted as a para.
Yes, yep.
So is a para admin?
It's a part-time, it's to support, I mean, it's anything that's related to it, supporting the administration is the way that if it's a little bit of secretarial help, or if it's a little bit of this, we would consider that, as we define administration, anything that's related to anything that would be categorized as administration, we don't define administration as an administrator. It's just not the nomenclature that applies as we think about it anyways. And maybe it's good that you ask so that we can explain.
Oh, no, I understand what you mean. I'm just saying the position is posted as a paraprofessional.
Yes,
But whatever. So
yes.
what is the cost if it's not the 40,000?
Oh, gosh. Let me look it up. See if I can get my hands on that. Let me see. Gonna take them up. Let me look it up instead of everybody sitting here while I dig through records. I'll get back to you.
Can I ask a separate question?
Sure.
The last row says that there's a physical therapist coming in and that the funding source is to replace the PT or to eliminate the PT assistant.
Yes.
So is the physical therapist coming in a fractional FTE for a full-time
Yes.
FTE? Okay.
Yeah.
And then oh, sorry, go ahead.
0.6.
Okay. And then for the line above that, it looks like it's a para at Runkle being swapped for a para at Runkle. Is that accurate?
Oh, well, I probably had a mistake.
Okay.
No, that's
Okay.
not.
I thought, that seems like very detailed reporting.
That is microscopic there. I'll look
Okay.
that up. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions on the position report?
I'm sorry that I interrupted earlier. I just want to make sure that we're careful with tone, because if you indeed really want to question whether something is worthwhile, that's the tone that comes through when we're sort of, very careful about nomenclature and everything, is that for some reason we don't trust that the principal needs yet this again, right? We've already said no to a couple of things. We're kind of in that place where just, I think at this point, have to be a little bit careful with what we're pressing forward with.
Are you speaking to me, Sarah?
Yes, I am.
Oh, well, my role here is to analyze the information, so I'm comfortable asking questions, but thanks.
It is worth mentioning that, the recess monitor is within this larger bucket that was allocated last
Great.
spring.
It's a
I
little
just
over,
want-
little
Sorry,
over
go ahead.
19,000 for that recess monitor.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, Susan. I feel like this is an incredible level of detail, and I am just so grateful for it because it lets us connect the lines year to year. So it's really amazing, and thank you to you and your team and to HR too, if they're involved in this as well, for the finance and HR teams or whoever's doing this to pull it together, because it's really very helpful. Much appreciated. Okay, what's next on our agenda? Are we up to FY24 close?
No, we're going to talk about the potential amendment to the transportation.
Oh,
fund.
yes. Okay.
Let me pull that up.
So Susan, can I give a little voiceover of this? Is that okay? Based on our
Absolutely.
conversation earlier? Okay.
Yeah.
So I have to say that I read this and I am not intimately familiar with all the details of the bus contract. And so I was a little bit confused myself as I was reading this, like, there was a lot of details here and I couldn't follow along with the story completely. But Susan was wonderful in talking me through it a little bit earlier. And if it's okay with everyone, I would like to summarize the things that I think are the critical things to take away from this. And then Susan, maybe you fill in if I've forgotten. I had 3 of them. Let's see if I can remember the 3 things I thought were really important. And then we can go then we can open up the discussion. But the important thing that I think is here is, Betsy, if you don't mind just going to, well, actually it's here in the 3rd paragraph. So the 1.5 million that was in the Pierce building project budget for relocation included transportation. Originally within that 1.5 million was the 720,000, and that was an estimate. Now that the A&F team has worked out the details, it's actually going to be $50,000 less to provide the transportation than originally estimated. So that's good news. That means there's another $50,000 in the budget and we're coming in under cost, So this is excellent. I thought that was really, really good information to understand. The second big thing is that there is, sorry, let me turn that off. Is that that while the reason that this is coming to the school committee is because while the funding is coming from the project budget, the contract itself is through the schools and so the contract will be amended on our part, but the funding will come from the project budget. And then the third big thing, now I can't remember what my third big thing was. Susan, do you remember what the third thing was that I thought was important?
Explaining the analysis piece
Oh,
so that people
don't-
would understand the difference between routes and buses on the metro.
oh, yeah, I guess
don't know
that
if it was a
I found
highlight.
that my part of this was that the whole thing about buses was sort of a red herring, and that we don't need to know how many buses are providing the routes. The important thing is that there's 3 additional routes. And there's a lot of details here about all the first paragraph is a lot of different details about all the logistics of running the buses that that we probably would all require at least an associate's, if not a bachelor's degree in bus transportation to follow, as well as seeing the contract and really working through the details. And I'm not sure that that would be the best use of our time, but the important thing is that people who have done it have run out all the numbers and it's coming in under cost. That's my big overview of it. Susan, is there anything else you want to add? And then I'll go to Val for her questions or comments.
No, it was merely the first section there was just really related to the kind of things that I would include amendment to the contract. So that was my rationale for putting some of those details in. But I understand now, in so doing, I've confused people. And I apologize for that. I was trying to be really diligent. And the second part where the note and the analysis was just to provide you with information about how the addendum that we're agreeing to would then be funded, because it wouldn't be coming out of our operating budget. So apparently I did a very poor job of
No,
of that, trying to consolidate a lot of information sometimes when I'm so in the weeds. Sometimes I lose the reader, and I apologize for that.
no worries. It was a lot of detail beyond my skill, but it's clear that you are intimately versed with what's going on with the buses. So thank you. Val, go ahead, and then Carolyn.
Thanks. So Susan, I just want to understand, the only thing that we're amending in the contract is that we're adding routes. That's it? We're just striking out and adding a line that says we're adding these routes. There's no change to our, anything else. Is that right?
No, what we're doing is we're adding additional routes. And it will take, 2 buses. Each bus runs 2 routes. And so when you have 3 routes, it takes 2 buses. And that's why on the analysis on the next page, it says 2, not 3. It's
Yep.
because,
Okay, thank you.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Thanks. And Susan, I might ask you to say that again, but maybe it doesn't matter. What I'm trying to understand is what this is. I guess I want to roll back a little bit to understand sort of the base cost. So typically, my understanding is, like last year, PSB contracts 4 buses. This year, we're contracting 6 buses. Is that correct?
no. Last year we had 6, this year we had 6. I think what shifted last year is that 2 buses that were previously funded out of a revolving fund because riders paid fees at the high school. Those fees were eliminated. And so last year, all 6 buses were paid for out of the operating budget. This year, it's the same.
Okay, because I'm just looking at something that says we had 4 buses last year.
In this
So-
memo or somewhere else?
On the transportation page. Because what I'm trying to understand is what the base cost for running the buses for Pierce is. They're new, I would think they're new buses, and I'd like I know from working on the South Brookline bus, it's just like, how much is a bus? $180,000 a year. That's the contract for that bus. So I'm trying to understand what is the contract for the Pierce buses to begin with? And is that what we're adding to? Or you're,
Yeah, there isn't a contract for the Pierce budget. There isn't a contract for the Pierce transportation because it didn't exist. The amendment to the contract is to add the Pierce transportation. So
but
a
if
base,
we have buses that are already running routes, and again, my understanding is we had 4 buses and they run routes, and now we have new routes. So how is that not 2 additional physical buses?
because we're not adding buses, we're adding routes. So the contract states that each bus runs 2 routes. Now they're running 3. Or
So this is a,
some cases,
so
so
if, like, I'm picturing literally the bus number 1, bus number 2, 3, 4. And those buses have always run their routes in Brookline. Now we have a new route. So how do we not have an additional contract to service the Pierce students?
that's what we're doing. That's why this is before you.
And so that new bus is 164,000 a year. And that's the numbers here.
So Eastern bus, so there's 2 parts to it. If you look at the analysis, there's the Eastern component,
Yep.
which is 2 buses at the reduced rate, right? So if you do a standard bus under the contract, it's $550 for this year.
Yep.
because we're not adding whole new buses, we're adding routes, the rate is reduced to $355 for the Pierce addition. Okay, so I
Yep.
negotiated down from $550 to $355 for these additional routes because I argued that we are not adding full buses. So they reduce the
Adding
rate.
a physical bus, so it's like the bus, I'm gonna make this up, goes from South Brookline to Z Block. And then that same physical bus, let's call it bus number 1, then is repurposed to do the Pierce route.
Yes,
Got it, okay, thank you.
yeah.
Like I have to sort of picture the physical buses, and so this, even though this has all been running, we're just approving it now.
We
We're
are, but yes, because since in practice, we're not actually gaining 2 new buses.
Mhm.
It didn't make sense to go ahead and pay for 2 new buses when when in reality, we're just adding routes. So I've been working with the director of operations and the bus company to come up with an agreement that I'm bringing before you tonight. You know, for the Pierce school transportation,
Okay,
which winds up being less expensive. Now, the next line, so you see Eastern. Eastern doesn't have a capacity if we have more riders to add. So our second bus company is RSC, and this is our new special education bus contractor. And they have indicated that they can add a van who could do multiple shuttles if we get into a situation where we have more ridership than capacity on the Eastern buses. So I'm including in the budget for the Pierce transportation this kind of circuit breaker, or so that if, as we get into the cold weather, more students ride, then we'll have the ability to be able to add yet another one. So the combination of the two, so $299 was the contracted rate with RSC, and the combination of the Eastern plus this RSC would bring us to those 2 buses. We don't need it right now, but since I'm projecting out for the building project what the longer term costs are, we included that here in the analysis. But I'm not looking for an addendum because we bid these, the rates for RSC last spring. So we're all set in as far as that goes. I'm just trying to tie the numbers out so you understand, especially those of you who are participating in building committee meetings and are interested in the transportation component of the relocation costs, that you understand with clarity what has been included in the budget. And so that's why I'm providing that here, so that you as the school committee understand what the total costs are and where I arrive them, how I arrived them.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah.
Carolyn, I just want to be mindful, we're at 5:40 already, and I just want to make sure, like, if you could have like maybe one more question on it, but we're going to not be able to even get through the rest of our stuff if we spend too much time on.
sure, I
this.
wanted to understand that adding 2 buses on Wednesday afternoon.
That's folded into this
Okay,
as we agreed to it, so we're not paying extra for that. We have a blended rate at the $355 to account for that. The $355 is a blended rate to account for that, for the Wednesday afternoons.
got it.
Yep.
Carol, go ahead. Hopefully a
I'll
quick
try to make-
question.
I'll make this real quick. So you're projecting out the costs for 4 years. You said you have a fixed cost contract. Is there any, do we bear any risk for changes in, or potential benefit for changes in fuel prices? So if
It's built in. The escalator is built in already. That's why you see, Carol, if you see under Eastern, the costs are increasing slightly. That's all based on the contract.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so the motion, if Betsy, if you don't mind going up to the first page. Motion I'll make is to authorize the administration to amend the Eastern Bus Company contract to add the routes needed to transport students to the Fisher Hill campus during the Pierce construction project based on the terms outlined above. Can I just ask one question now that I'm reading out that loud? Susan, even though RSC was on the table on page 2, we don't need to amend that contract. We only need to amend Eastern Bus.
Correct.
Okay. So I'm going to make the motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes,
Val?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yep.
And I vote yes. Thank you. Okay. Next item on the agenda is
That-
the FY.
we just absolutely need to say thank you to Susan, because we got in a situation in the past where we hadn't had that contract for the extra additional that came up. And so it's just, we're in such a better place right now. So thank you, Susan.
Great.
Welcome.
We're going to pick up the FY24 budget report. Is this Diane or who's taking this?
Diane's taking this.
Okay. Diane, you're on mute. Gets you every time. Betsy, can you make it bigger while Diane's coming off mute?
Sorry about that. Betsy, yep, Betsy's got it, okay. The amended budget shows the increase that we were voted from the good graces of the advisory committee. And as of September 15th, we spent most of it. We had more bills come in very late in June. We had more encumbrances come in very late in June that distressed me heartily. But it was within the scope of the projections we had done. And this is where we stand. So at the moment, it looks like the 89,000 will be going back to free cash, but I have heard rumors that some additional FY24 bills have turned up.
Questions? Diane, are you ready for questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I just want to say, by my calculation, the additional cost brought us over the budget by 0.3% of the budget. So this is quite close to the original budget. And if we were 0.3% under the budget, we'd all be a little bit happier, but this is really very impressive to bring it in so close. So thank you for that work. Any questions from the committee on the FY24 close? I would ask Diane, when does the close actually close?
When the town finishes with the audit,
Okay,
so there'll be little tweakies, but you know, this is the essence of it. We've submitted the end of the year report to DESI, which is, sorry, I shouldn't speak in jibber jabber. For those who don't know, the end of the year report is the very extensive accounting of educational costs from both the school committee and the municipality that's submitted from every school district in the state to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. If you go to their website and you look at per pupil expenditures, the end of the year report is where they get that information. And they use that to publish information about per pupil expenditures and also to report to the federal government. It lags sometime behind, usually a year or two behind, but it's a very important fiscal report for all school districts.
thank you. Other questions from the committee or advisory committee colleagues? Of course, you're always welcome to ask questions. I have another question, which is, I know that we already had set our budget in our categories for the current fiscal year, but was there anything that happened? Like, are we going to adjust any of the categories at all, given anything that happened in FY24? Adjust them any more past where we already adjusted them? Does that question make sense?
It does. And I think that's part of what we're working on for the quarterly report for 25.
Okay. Which, speaking of which, we are not going to do that tonight because the
We're
quarterly
working on
report
that.
is not right exactly. So that one will be deferred for a month. Okay, that's helpful to understand. Okay, if there's no more questions from the participants, then we will go on to our next item on the agenda. Thank you, Diane, for that presentation.
Very welcome.
Okay, so budget development. So we originally had been considering that we were going to talk about both the non-aligned positions as well as user fees. And if you all recall, we had reviewed the non-aligned positions in the spring, and we had some questions on them. For example, why were certain directors paid at certain rates, and why were there just was like generally questions around the rationale behind the pricing or the fee, the compensation, my goodness, the compensation structure for the different positions. And I think that, and the team is still working on that. And also, if you recall, the non-aligned fees or the non-aligned compensation also didn't include the non-aligned salaries for central office staff, which typically it would include that because the benchmarking had not been complete at that point. So like the FY25 Q1 report, we're going to defer the non-aligned salary. We're going to focus on the fees tonight. Before we get into the fees discussion, I want to give a little bit of a preface and a history, and then we have a vote on the agenda, and I want to take that one first, and then we'll get into the meat of the fees. So the history of the fees was we took up building user fees as well as the other user fees in pretty great detail in spring of 2023. And we did a whole redo of the user fees, which hadn't been touched since before COVID. And then, as you all might recall, I feel like we're talking about COVID a lot tonight, Carla, but we weren't renting out the buildings either for multiple years during COVID. And so the rates were not refreshed since before COVID. And in the meantime, we had quite a large increase in particular, I'll say utilities costs that are part of the additional usage that the building incurs during these off-hour uses. And so we had refreshed all of the building fee rates at that point. And then, so that was spring of 2023. And then if you all recall, Matt Gillis moved on later that spring / in the summer. And then we did not have an operations director for a year. Luckily now we have Joe Albuquerque, who is exactly thumbs up for Joe. And we're really thrilled to have him here. And he is still getting caught up with all of the different buildings operations aspects, including the building rental. And so what Susan and I have discussed is giving Joe and Susan this year to get their arms around how the building rentals work now, and then also look at how they should work, and then also look at sort of clearing up any sort of we'll say legacy user fee questions that might have arisen due to miscommunication or due to lack of communication, different things that could have happened. And so basically, the idea would be to have a vote to authorize staff to look into and clear and negotiate any sort of prior or current year charges, because there's still, again, what we set up in 23 and then making sure it actually got implemented correctly. Some of the charges may have come in too high. So they're going to work through any of the details this year, clear everything up, learn how things work, and come back to us after the end of this year with the sort of fresh understanding and a proposal for how we should be handling this going forward. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Joe's been here, I think, just around 3 months. So this is there's quite a bit of work to do. And so my proposal would be to make a motion to, I think we have the wording on here. So vote to authorize staff to negotiate prior and current year charges, and it should say relating to building rental fees. So I hope that was clear. It's just a lot of history and like letting staff have the time and the space to get caught up and make sure that all of the accounts are caught up and understood.
And sorry, we don't have, that's not in our materials, but you're putting something on the screen? No, there's nothing on the screen. But it's on the agenda just as a 3
point
Oh.
3A.2 as a possible vote. We'll get into
Okay.
the whole fees discussion, but I'm sort of saying, let's park the building rental fees portion of this. We will talk about other fees, but just the building rental fees portion of it, which I say just, like, if you look at the total fees, it's this one area, which is quite complex and huge, but there's lots of other fees to talk about. So we're going to give them, the goal is to give them a year to wrap their arms around it, and we'll discuss the rest of the fees and make a plan for those separately.
And this is the stuff we've talked about before, like after school programs, weekend programs.
Music school, extended days, enrichment,
Yeah,
churches who rent.
on the weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different renters who use the
Okay,
different
and so
spaces.
you're saying, let's just park it,
That's right. They'll continue to do the operation, like they're
Yeah, yeah,
actually
yeah,
doing the
yeah.
operations, right? But we're
but
not going to
not
try
do
and
that relooking.
exactly until they
Thank you.
have the sort of the data to be coming at it from a really informed perspective. Okay, so I made the motion. Do I have a second? Thank you, Val. Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yep, yes.
Val?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Question on this vote that we just took. Does it need to be a recommendation to full school committee, or can the finance subcommittee sort of take this on their own? That's, I guess, a question for Susan and Betsy.
Well, since it's policy and policy is school committee, not finance specific, I would say yes. During your
Okay.
report, you should probably,
Okay.
yeah.
So then that vote was a recommendation to full school committee that we do whatever I just said. And then, and Betsy, will you make sure it's on our next agenda?
I will, I'll put it on for the 30th.
Thank you. Okay, so that was a little bit of the history, and now I think I'll turn it over to you, Susan, to talk about some of the other context, how you want to approach this in terms of best practices and looking at the fees we have and where we're going to go.
Yes. So Betsy, if you can.
Yes,
Yes.
sorry. Here we go.
Yeah, there we go. So one of the things that is helpful to people that are paying user fees is to have some measure of predictability. And it's also helpful from an administrative standpoint to not to have to take a deep dive into every single user fee program every year to evaluate whether the fee is adequate or not. So what Mariah and I have been talking about, or it might have even been considered before, is that you get on a rotation so that each year you do a set number of reviews and the others remain relatively flat unless there's a reason to incrementally increase over the year at a certain set rate, like cost of living type thing. But what I have before you is for discussion is this rotation. So this year we would look at BEEP and base. And the reason for that is because, of course, BEEP just went to full day, and we set a tuition rate without really having all the data around enrollment and interest. So we felt that we should take another look at that since we didn't have any historical data to rely on this fall after enrollments for the program were well into I don't want to say complete, because we could have shifts from now until the end of the year, but at least we'd have a good sense of what the enrollments would be, and then we could look and see how does that relate to tuitions. So that's why BEEP, and then base has had some challenges over the last number of years, and we have some concern about their solvency. And so looking at base early to see if there's some adjustments that need to be made so that they are able to at least break even, I think is important, because if that program can't be self-sustaining, we really need to think about the impact that has as we balance our educational needs, or our core services, and the expenses associated with that against some of these more ancillary programs that we offer, which are wonderful if you can do that, but not necessarily core to our mission. So that's why BEEP and base. And then next year we would look at staff material fees, intramurals at the middle or extramurals at the middle school, and athletics and the use of facilities. And that might be a heavy lift to have all of those in one year, because athletics and extramurals is huge. So is our material fee program and use of facilities. Those are some really big and involved programs. So that might be too much for one year. But I know that the three material fees, as well as use of facilities, we've kind of committed to looking at next year. And I would like to look at middle school extramurals and athletics at the same time. And then in 28, food service, the summer school programs, and then the Tappan Green Restaurant, what we charge there to folks that enjoy the wonderful food the kids are preparing. So that was my thought. Of course, you have academic testing fees, and those are just really pass through from the College Board. So we would set that. We can't set them at this time of year. And then also in the past, you've had visual arts and career and tech ed fees that you charge, and you really can't charge fees for kids to participate in a core course that's being offered in your schools. So
I can get my $40 back?
So next year, we're not, because the budget was built last year, before I realized that we were charging fees for this, we decided that we would keep the fees for the current year, but as we build the budget next year, we've got to build those expenses into our base budget. So not this year, next year.
Susan, can you remind us? I don't think those had huge budgets. I want to say like that was maybe less than $100,000 between the two of them. Am I remembering right?
Yes, less than that.
Okay.
I think one was 40. I was looking at that earlier today, but recollection on the fly is not. Oh, here we go. I don't know what we'll take in this year, but I know when we did the analysis last year, it was 20,800 was what we anticipated for fee receipts from visual arts, and 26,400 from career and tech education. So yeah, 47,000 between them.
Okay.
So I don't know how you feel about that rotation, if that makes sense, if people have thoughts or an interest in moving these around a little bit.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Sorry if I missed this, Susan. The second to last one, use of facilities, is that just, that's sort of like the general stuff that Mariah was talking about before?
Yes.
Okay. And does that include, we don't charge nonprofits that use space in our buildings, or we don't put those out through the central register? For example, like the BEF, I think Steps to Success, they have space in school buildings that for their offices,
Mhm.
but those are, I think they're free. Is that something that gets looked at or has a process?
It's not
Those are
attractive-
separate from this.
Yeah, they're not the same
Yeah.
as this.
It's
Okay.
not just like those, it's like some PTOs or, there's spaces where there are some rooms. And I think those are supposed to be, I don't know, there was some sort of other research you had found on that, but that's separate from these facility user fees.
Right.
But I will say that there's a parallel in that essentially entities whose entire purpose is to support Brookline Public Schools and who are nonprofits, and all of their profits go back into supporting the Brookline Public Schools, like the PTO. The PTOs can rent space at a 0% rate too. Because essentially it's just taking money and putting it from one pocket into the other, because the PTO would be paying rent for something that would mean that that money is not going to the school. It's all when nonprofits, that's the rationale behind that, is that the nonprofits strictly devoted to PSB are not being charged rent. Anyway, it is not included. Susan, I think that this schedule is reasonable. I feel concerned about next year for the same reasons that you do. On the other hand, and one possibility is we could talk to the materials fee liaisons. And if you wanted to, for example, defer materials fee another year to make it more balanced, perhaps they would be comfortable with that as well.
I think that'd be great.
Okay, I can reach out to them and check in on that, because I just think that like the facilities and athletics, like they're all of those, like you said, they're just incredibly complex to figure out what's going on. So perhaps that's a good way to approach that. And I do think it would be much more balanced if materials fee moved out a year. And we were to continue what we have been doing, which is essentially a small cost of living adjustment, but not the full analysis of the calculation.
Yeah.
Carla.
It just crossed my mind, the recreation department uses school facilities, correct? And my understanding was that there's been an MOA in the works for, I don't know how many years. Has that finally been negotiated and signed?
No, that's some of what we're discovering, and kind of making a list of all the things that need to get done, but have been delayed for a variety of reasons. That has not been completed, but we are aware of that.
Okay. And would there be fees involved with that, or you don't know at this point?
I don't know at this point. We were just informed about it recently, and so we just put it in our parking lot of things that we have to look into.
Very crowded parking lot.
Yeah, it is a very crowded parking lot. We might have to, hire a few of those
Valets.
crossing guards.
It's like the Trader Joe's in Coolidge Corner.
Exactly.
One, at least historically, the agreement between rec and the schools was essentially no one was paying for each other's space. That was historically the agreement. I don't know where it's going to end up.
I don't either, and I think there's many things that need to be part of the conversation, So, but we have not begun a dialogue with them around that.
So, Susan, do you need just sort of a general indication or blessing from the committee of like, yes, this sounds reasonable, plus I'm happy to reach out to the materials fee liaison? Do you need a vote, or how do you want to proceed for this?
No, I just want the consensus that this is, with the way you'd like to move forward, so that I'm not spinning my wheels or giving you something when you want to take a deep dive into user fees this year and I'm giving you beep. So this will make it a little bit more predictable and help the finance team, as well as the data team, who would, likely have to produce some enrollment information. Gives us a little bit of a heads up moving forward. So yeah, if you're comfortable with this, if you want to vote it, that's fine. That doesn't have to go before the committee, but just kind of a commitment to doing them in rotation for all the reasons that we've talked about.
I'm
Sarah?
comfortable with that.
Oh, go ahead.
think I'm comfortable with that. I think that your explanation was really thorough. And so we can just say that we are informed, and I appreciate being informed.
Great. And Val had to jump off. She'll be back if we're still going in about 20 minutes, but I think she can comment on it later on. I do think, and our plan is that then at the next meeting, we would start to talk about tuition and base. And I think base is a very big conversation, and putting it under the rubric of fees, or the heading of fees, might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's certainly part of the story. So maybe we'll start to talk about that I think that's on our agenda for our next meeting, is to start to continue to wade into fees. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. Right? Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, it is. What I was hoping for, like, I have clarity around what to provide you for information on BEAT because of the work that we did last year. So it's like refreshing that. So there's a framework for that. There really isn't a framework for BASE. And so if I could just get your thoughts about what would be helpful for information,
Yeah.
to get the conversation going, that would be very beneficial.
One of the things that I think I would find helpful, and on this, I certainly want to hear from everyone, is comparisons, because there's a lot of ways in which many of our programs, they're peer comparisons. Like, for example, BEEP, people aren't going to go to send their kid to a preschool in Cambridge in the same way that they would in BEEP, right? Like, there's some things that have community mobility and some that don't. But I think adult ed, there is a certain aspect of community mobility and comparison shopping. So to the extent that that you can provide some sort of neighboring community comparisons with what adult ed costs to participate, I think that that would be helpful. And to the extent we can also get not only sort of a sense of their, like, what are they willing to provide, or can we glean from public information their revenue and expense model generally, that would be helpful as well. Revenue, expense, staffing, like, how does this all come together for neighboring communities in a way that it feels like it hasn't come together recently for BASE?
Okay.
Sarah, go ahead.
Yep, that's what I was going to ask, is basically that's the way that we figure out what the market will bear and for our fees. And so that's the way to go about it.
And my concern is that there's, for whatever reason, our revenue model or our expense model is different in some way that we might be looking at peers who are pricing in a way that we can't afford to match. So I just, there's that question in my mind as well. And then if we can't, why? That's the other half of that. But
yeah, I can get there. Yeah, I can get some, I'm sure I can get some basic information. One of the questions that I ponder is also internal competition. And I don't understand, I haven't looked at this deeply, and you all as folks in the community would certainly have better insight than I do, but it seems to me like, BASE is, though it says adult education, there is a component that is student enrichment, it feels like to me. And I wonder, and recreation sometimes, and I guess I don't have clarity about how we either compete against in other internal community groups for the same population of students or families for similar service. So I don't know if you can provide me with any clarity about, like, we have this big enrichment program. Those folks rent our buildings, which is fantastic. We also have a rec department. We have BASE.
I don't think that the enrichment program because the programs that BASE offers and is more of the internal competition, so to speak, is rec, because they're offering summer programs, they're offering vacation programs, and they're offering weekend, like, one-off classes. And both groups are doing that. The enrichment programs that exist tend to be very school specific, and they're only offered like after school days for limited periods. So they're not vacation programs, they're not summer programs, they're not weekend programs.
Okay.
So they operate in different time spaces.
Would it be helpful to maybe see if I can find and provide some information about, like, what rec is providing?
I think so. Yeah.
Comparison to what we're providing. I'm sure I should be able to get that information.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
Okay, so we'll get peer neighboring communities, revenue, expenses, staffing plans. If they do have a program, I could maybe look at that. What they're offering. I can get from the rec department what they're offering, and then a list of offerings from our our program, we can work with Michelle on that. What
And
else
the
might-
other thing, Susan, is I want to differentiate between adult education programs, which you are too. But like, for example, an adult might be interested in going to Cambridge for an evening program, but it's unlikely that like a student is going to go do a summer program in another town. So I think it's like making sense of,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like the differentiation between like, it's like on the student side, it's like rec versus base. And then on the, and even like, I think base offers music lessons and then Brookline Music School offers lessons. So like, but the base, I'm not really clear on that whole thing. So like, there's the student programs and then there's the adult programs. And the adult programs, it makes sense to market against the peer communities, and the student programs, it makes sense to look at Brookline versus Brookline.
yeah. Okay, is there anything else that might be helpful? I just don't want to get into the conversation and, you know, and say, have you all say, oh, geez, you know, we can't really move forward with the discussion without X information, but you can think about that more.
I'm
just,
not sure I agree with Mariah. I mean, I've taken my kids to other towns for summer stuff all the time, but I'm not sure that matters, and I'm not really looking to wade into this. It sounds like Mariah and Susan can handle this.
Well, I guess it's fine with like, you're probably right that people might go to like a nearby town. I guess my point was I was thinking there's no need to go benchmark like all of the, like I wouldn't get like 10 benchmarks of the student programs, I guess, right? Like it might be helpful to get
Right.
one or two. I agree with you.
Totally agree.
Like maybe like Newton and Cambridge or something that are like right next door to us.
Or not. Whatever you guys think is the best way to do it, I'm sure will be the best way to do it. So.
Carla, go ahead.
What about the library's programs? Are they too few and far between to be considered in this particular category?
I don't think they charge, do they? Aren't they all sort of like story hours and one-offs?
They could be. I'm really not sure. I don't think they're completely one-offs, because I think they have book groups and poetry readings and such. And as for charging, I don't know.
Well, it's worth looking into.
I'll ask around. I mean,
Yeah, I'm sure the library director can tell you if
Yeah.
they charge.
They've got some great programs, that's for sure.
okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Susan, on BEEP tuition, are you gonna explore both the BEEP tuition and the extended day program that we authorized this year for Lynch Center?
Can put that on the list.
Thanks. Because I know we approved a rate and I have no idea what it was based on.
I don't either.
Okay, good.
That was kind of done. Yeah, that I wasn't really,
Yeah, that was a late addition to the roster.
yeah.
So
It was, and I think some of the conversations around all that were while I was out on leave. But I'm not. And or amnesia from medication as a result of the medical leave. I have a skip or two in my mind, so. Okay, I will
thank you.
find out more about that.
Okay, I feel like we've talked about this a lot, and as I said, I'll go back to the materials fee liaisons and ask about the deferral 1 year out. Do we have anything else on the agenda?
I would say under new business, I had prepared the information about the community comps.
Oh, right. Yes, that's right.
And I feel like and the other thing I also want to mention is that when we talk about non-aligned compensation, there's two groups that fall within that. One group is again the salaries for non-aligned staff, and that has not been looked at in, I think, about 4 years. I think it was 21 when I read the last memo that was brought forward. So some of the work that we will do this year is a review of salaries for non-aligned positions. So when we look at that, you know, we identify comparative communities, And so doing a little bit of research, I learned that these 10 communities are the ones that have been used here in Brookline in the past. So if you look at the last round of negotiation with teachers, for example, these are the communities that were used. So that's helpful for me to know. But curious as I am, I like to have an understanding of why these are comps for Brookline. There's different ways that comps are identified, and I think depending on what you're trying to get information about, it's important to know the value of a community's data in comparison to yours. So I did a little bit of digging to see if I could identify where these came from. The ones that are in italic came from the DESE DART community comps. So DESE uses student benchmark data or uses student demographic data to identify like communities. There's 9 for Brookline, 5 of them appear here. And then another way to look at it is a community's ability to pay or community demographics. So population size, tax rates, property values, household income. So that's another way to look and see, is this community similar to ours or not? Proximity is another way that comps can be identified, and proximity is super important to Brookline because it's really hard to get here. And so when we're looking at market and being competitive, especially when it's salaries, you have to factor in people's ability to travel here. I have a very painful commute to get to Brookline, so I know this firsthand, and it's not something that in the long run would be sustainable for most people. And so looking at proximity or those communities that are contiguous to you is also another factor, because you want to be attractive, and bright and up and coming teachers and paraprofessionals or even custodians are not going to be traveling up to the North Shore for a job, right? They're going to try to stay local. So making sure that we're competitive with our surrounding communities is important. It looks like a couple of these that were selected are that. And then the last one is performance. Sometimes you want to look at, communities that you aspire to be like, or that you feel are comparable to you academically. And so those are usually the 4 ways that the four different ways you look at is a community or school district comparable to us. So I've provided you with data on these communities in Brookline. The DART data is right off the DESE website. Now it's not, as Diane said, it's not last year's data, right? It lags a year or two, but it lags a year or two for everybody. So when we're looking at comps and comparisons here, then it's great that the data is from the same time, space, and sequence that ours is being gathered and reported. So I share this with you. Again, in italics are the 5 communities that DESE has identified as comparable to us. And this is the data they use in order to determine that, the enrollment data, that is. I also included on this teachers, and this is not all staff. I think there gets confusion when members of the public go on to the DESE website. If you don't know what the definitions of some of these things are, then you might say, wow, you only have 400 teachers. No, or 400 staff members. That's not true. But this is the teachers, the certified teachers in our schools. I like to look at student-teacher ratio because that tells us a lot about, well, it tells us a lot of different things, but, and I also like to look at administration and per pupil expenses. This comes into play, like as we're looking at bang for the buck, I always say analysis that we start to look at, our programs and our outcomes academically. And we say, we're performing far better than Lexington. I'm making this up. I don't know what, how our.
Can I interrupt 1 second? Betsy, can you scroll down so Brookline's visible on the bottom of the
Okay.
second table? Like make it so both tables are visible? Go back up a little more, just so that there we go. Thank you.
Yeah. So if academically we outperform Lexington and we're paying more per pupil, then you say, okay, is that performance related to some other factor like our student-teacher ratios? Does it have something to do with our administrative structure in comparison to them? So once I get that information, which I've talked to Jody about for these communities, then we'll be able to do a little more sense making out of the data and how one might relate to the other for this current round of looking at salary comps for non-aligned as well as we're evaluating programs. And as I said, I call it bang for the buck. Maybe that's a crude way to look at it, but what is our
Value.
investment?
Value. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What is the value of what we're offering, and what's the difference between what we're offering? When we see something that's attractive to us, what are they doing differently? And let's try to drill down on that. So anyway, that's why I find comps to be very valuable, and comps shouldn't change, and you shouldn't have comp conversations when you're in the middle or just starting your negotiation process. It really should be, I think, a little bit more empirical when you identify what they are, know why that they're comps and why we're using them, because it's easy to cherry pick, and I'm not a cherry picker. And then once you identify what these comps are for you, if we stay with these, great. I don't have, skin in the game. I have some ideas as I'm looking through it. Is this really a comp, and why do we have it? But we
Can I
talk.
ask, what were the 4 communities identified by DESE that aren't in our standard, our historical comp list we use? Do you remember?
I can tell you, Chelmsford was one of them, which was surprising. I think Milton, I can pull that up pretty quick. You give me a second.
And then my follow-up question is, would you recommend adding those or any other and or subtracting any of the ones we have?
I can offer some, let me get to your first question.
Sure.
I have to bring up a spreadsheet. Okay. So the others were Melrose, Milton, Natick,
Is it Chelmsford,
and
Milton,
Chelmsford.
Melrose, Natick?
Yep,
Natick's here though, isn't it? Oh no, Needham's here. Sorry.
Needham's here. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, so those were the ones that were, and that's strictly by this enrollment demographic, which is in the first thing. So your enrollment size, the percentage low income, students with disabilities, and ELL percentages. That's the sole basis of how they come up with that. Some of them, as I look, so I look at more than one. I never think you should look at just, one through one lens when you're trying to evaluate and assess information. I like to look at multiple measures. So DOR, I got that off of the DOR website. Also, these are links, and I don't know if they're active in the PDF or not, but I can certainly provide the links where you find this information. And I also put the date that I pulled it because when they do update it, you know, the data that's on the website obviously would be different than the information that I'm sharing with you here. So now I have to find you back. Your second question, Mariah, was
Would you
some
add any or
impressions.
subtract? Yeah.
Yeah, so some impressions. Boston is not really a comparable. They're next to us, but when you're looking at salary comps, you might want to keep an eye to what they're doing there, but it's 46,000 students. Of course, your administrative staff is going to be paid accordingly, you know, so they're always going to be paid far more than anybody else in the state. And when you look at the demographic data here, not only just with enrollment, but the percentage of low income is, it's just not comparable to us. Their student population demographics don't look similar. And then when you look at, if you go down to the DOR data, that really doesn't look similar, you know, to what I would consider to be similar to us, you know. So I wouldn't, if I'm looking at it, I'd maybe provide the information, but I wouldn't include it as a legitimate comp when we're looking at market conditions. But you want to keep an eye to it because we do recruit people from Boston. So it's important to know, you know, what's out there and where they're at. Cambridge is another one. There are aspects like the size of the student population is similar, but when you look at like low income factors and the others, I can see why they don't show up as a DESI DART comp for us. When I look down at the DOR data, you know, a significantly larger population, almost double the size of Brookline. And some of the other factors when you're looking at like tax rate and household income and average tax bill, there's a relationship between those. And so I like to look at that. I like to look at that, though, in relation to property value and median household income. I wasn't able to find median household income for these communities that was of the same time frame. And so I'd have to do some more digging, but that's really helpful. It's like, I call it the ability to pay of a community. And when you're looking at, you know, the level of taxing and capacity, I always find that to be helpful just to identify if it's similar. Not because we should aspire to be like them and have their same tax rate, don't misunderstand me. It's just to see to what degree they are comparable to us. And so when I look at that, I would say Boston, Cambridge, we should keep an eye to, but I would not include it in an average because they're not similar enough to, I don't believe I would consider them to be comparable, but important because they're so close to us. When I'm looking at, like, I can see why Needham would be included. I can say, okay, I see some similarities there. They're smaller, but I can see when we're looking at average family household value, you know, the per capita income and stuff. I can see some factors there that would suggest, and I'm going to guess when we look at the academic data, maybe there's some similarities there too, but I don't know yet. The one that is like a real, like Welsing's not close to us. There is some similarities there. The one that I don't see how it can be a comp in any way right now is Winchester. We wouldn't recruit from Winchester. They're too far away. I don't see how that's a comp. So if we were gonna, if anything, I would put another community that's in close proximity to us because they're part of the market we would be, you know, trying to poach or recruit staff out of, or Winchester wouldn't be one of those. So those are my impressions. I don't know if anybody here has been part of the dialogue before on why Winchester would be included, but I don't see that as being similar.
Thank you, Susan. I have a follow-up, but I'll hold and let Harry go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that if you're looking at tax rates and value of the homes, Boston, Cambridge, Brookline, and Somerville, if it were there, are the three localities that have rather substantial residential exemptions whereas none of these other towns do. So that's going to kind of skew your outlook a little bit, where if you're not quite comparing apples to apples with those towns.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Susan, if you were to tier these, what would you call the communities like Boston and Cambridge, which you mentioned, or how would you present them alongside these other ones? What do you call them if you don't call them comps? This is just a terminology question for my own understanding.
Yeah. Maybe yeah, you could say tier 2 comps or something like that, or tier 2 communities. Or you can, yeah. Boston for sure I wouldn't include when comparing at all, because like I said, it doesn't matter what we look at. It's not going to be, even when I look at what they're paying, it's just a different animal entirely. So I would say at least those two I would pull out, but keep the data and keep an eye on it. I think it would be helpful to have a comp or two that's close in proximity, because that's who we'd recruit from. It's hard to get here. It's a huge problem. And when we're looking at salary data and we're looking at benefits, I just think that, you know, the salary's not the only thing. Working conditions are hugely important, and that's where the commute part comes into play. So
From that perspective, Natick and Milton on the DESI one seem more logical to me.
yes.
Not Chelmsford.
Not
Is
Chelmsford.
not Chelmsford. I can't remember. It was Chelmsford, Natick, Milton, and Melrose, and not Melrose either. Melrose is next to Winchester. That feels like a big haul.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I can see why those weren't included. But I think the other ones, you know, are contenders.
Okay.
So
Any
that's
other
that. I'm gathering data based on your 10 comps, but you know, for me, it's like, you know, when I see Boston on there, I'm like, I don't, you know, it's going to skew the averages in a way that's, I don't know that it's beneficial and really tells us whether we're being competitive or not.
So are you, in this conversation, are you looking for guidance from the committee members of like, yes, add Natick Milton or whatever? Yes, remove Boston Cambridge, or are you just sort of giving us this background so that when we see this next time, we have a little bit more information and you'll decide whether or not you want to add or how to present the information?
Yeah, I think for one, if there's some consensus about having Boston and Cambridge at least be just, we can call them, you know, tier 2 or something like that, communities to us, and pulling that out. So I'm not giving you averages that include information. I'll give you the information, but not included in like the averages that I'm looking at.
I think that there's a distinction that we sometimes talk about in that they're like adjacent communities, but they're not really peer communities, right? There's a physical adjacency but that's the thing that we have in common with them as a border, not other characteristics. And so maybe that's the way to frame it. But yes, I would agree with pulling them out or just differentiating them.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with that. I'd also just like to say that I really approve of the way that you're looking at this, the way that you're trying to make the decision. And so I feel actually like you're better informed than I am, but I would leave like an opening, like Mariah said, to sometimes say like adjacent communities are different than communities. And I would allow yourself to select when you're talking about different things, different communities. I think that that's completely fine.
Yeah, the Winchester one is one that's the other one. Those three, the others, you know, I could make some argument that there's some similar characteristics here and there, but I don't see Winchester as being valuable to the analysis that we would be doing in comparing on any level, unless I see with the MCAS data that they are somehow a community we would aspire to be like from a learning outcome perspective. And so I would hold off final judgment until I get the rest of the data. And certainly your thoughts like Milton, you know, we could lean more heavily on that. Milton's close enough you could commute from, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Margaret commutes from Milton. She lives in Milton.
Yeah, yeah.
Just
And
as
a
one
couple of
example.
people, like Matt did, I know of
Yeah.
a couple of people that I know administratively that have lived in Milton. So I think that's reasonable. What was
Do you think you could add Milton and Natick in and then get your MCAS data too? And then we could all look at it and make a final
yeah.
decision? Okay.
I'm happy to do that, but if I am going to give you some comp information at the next meeting, I would want to know who I'm pulling from, but we can do that. I mean, there's no rush. As long as we have the salary guide set by December when I build the staffing roster for next year, then I'm fine with that if you're fine with that. I think this is valuable because next year you're going to go into negotiations with teachers, and to be able to have a rationale behind why we're using the comps that we're using and then use it consistently.
Mhm.
Then, you know, when I retire and somebody else sits in the seat, then it's grounded in something. And you should keep your comps. Once you really establish who they are, you should keep your comps as long as it's relative, you know? And I think that in Massachusetts, communities don't change significantly that quickly. And then you're able to start to look at like profiles and trends across your comp communities, and it becomes more meaningful over time. So anyways, that's I'm geeking out on you and I apologize.
Sounds good. I think we've got Carol and then Carolyn, and then I think we'll wrap up.
Just a quick comment. Our former town administrator previously worked at Winchester before he came here. And I used to commute up to Winchester regularly. So just because of its distance and lack of adjacency, I would not discount it as a potential comp. There's a lot of things about Winchester on the surface that remind me of Brookline, but I think you could potentially have people who would be interested in commuting to both Winchester and to Brookline.
Thanks, Carol. Carolyn?
Thanks for all this, Susan. This is fun. The only thing I'm not entirely clear on in how you're thinking about this, and it doesn't tremendously matter, but I just thought I'd mention it to show you that I'm listening. I think you're talking about potential recruits, and I hear you talking about working, whether these are comparable towns to work in. And then I also hear you talking about living in the place and commuting from the place, which sounds like there's sort of an underlying assumption that, I don't know, yeah, so that, like, are you thinking about teachers who live in Milton, or that Milton would be a comparable place to work? Because if you're only talking about commuting, and you're not talking about recruiting necessarily people who necessarily live in these places, then I think the adjacency matters a little bit less, right? Like somebody could be working in Winchester and live in Brookline, and so then it is and if it's a comp in terms of as a workplace, then the adjacency doesn't matter as much, if that makes sense. If I'm following what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about, I'm sharing thoughts and impressions. So, and so what I would say is that Milton is a comp identified by DESE. And
Yep.
Milton is also in fairly close proximity, which is another measure
Yep.
you consider when looking at comps.
Got it.
You see what I'm saying? So
Yep.
it's like, it's the and both
Yep.
of those
Yep.
two
Got it.
factors. Yeah,
Right. Yep. And so in that case, I would agree, I think with Carol, right, that Winchester is probably going to show up as a similar type of community or a similar type of school district.
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the part that I haven't done. So for me, if it's a comp, it's not just like looking through one lens and saying it's a
Yeah,
comp because of
yeah.
this. It's like it's an and both. It's this and it's that. So, okay, I can buy that, not just because of this one factor that I'm looking at. Okay, it's this and it's close proximity, or it's this and it's also, you know, when you look at DOR data, you can see some community characteristics that are similar. So that's just how I like to approach it. Not one or the other.
Yeah.
But like there's more than one factor that
Yeah.
it's
I
just
met a
validating
teacher
and
today. I met a teacher today at Runkle, which would be so interesting in your lens. So this is his second year or first full year in Brookline. He was working in Southborough. He was living in Watertown. So when he started working in Brookline, that was better. Now he's bought a house far away and the commute is terrible, but of course he still loves it because we're great and he loves his job. So sort of all of those things were in the mix for that young man.
yeah, and it's a lot, right? It's, you know, if you have young children and you have a long commute, you know, then that factors into it. Because if you're trying to get to your back home because a kid needs you, then a long commute is problematic. And I know that just anecdotally, when I look at some of the exiting, it was a result of the commute. So it's something that I really am paying attention to. And when we put together the exit survey, which we'll use, you know, this year, this next season, then we'll have some insight into what factors are leading people to consider employment outside of Brookline. So, you know, I think we'll start to kind of build our story and our better understanding as we go along. But thank you
Thanks for the analysis, Susan. It's
yes.
really, really helpful to think about these things. And as you say, to think about them not when we're in the middle of negotiations, but well in advance, because it's really about really thinking about this outside of that arena. So,
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you all for the scintillating discussion. Thank you, Betsy. And have a wonderful night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye-bye.